Lewis and Harris form the third largest landmass in the British Isles. It's only 13 miles from Tarbert to the Lewis border, but before the main road was built and the boat was the main mode of transport here, they were physically separated from each other by this massive wall of magnificent mountains and by two huge sea lochs that almost cut the island in half. This has contributed greatly to their separate identities. The weather in this part of the trip was changeable, but I decided to take a detour at Ballallan to the area of South Lochs. The quaint old Ballallan post office sits well below the main road and is still open. The vast area of South Lochs is only connected to the rest of the island by a 3-mile long neck of land, which in the 17th century had a wall built across it to close it off. Only the northeast corner is inhabited. One of the most beautiful villages is Marvik, but when I arrived it was raining. I waited for a while in the hope that it would clear up, and I would be able to see it at its best, but it never did. It doesn't take much of an imagination to arrive as to why this area is called Lochs. A little further, as I rounded the crest of a hill, I arrived above the little village of Colbist, a group of scattered cottages enclosed by a circle of craggy hills, and of course with its obligatory loch. As I climbed out of Colbist, I came across a lovely little waterfall at the top of the pass, so I went over for a wee look. Just beyond the waterfall we come to a watershed as the road skirts a lovely little lily-clad lochen on its way south. I was disappointed by my trip into Lochs. It promised so much, but it was spoiled by the weather, and headed west on the way to my pit stop at Dreinish. Below is a wonderful view of the village of Kneep, with one of the many islands at the mouth of Loch Rogue. This is an unexpected and hidden little gem of a corner of Lewis. Kneep has a harbour and a lovely little beach. I climbed onto the high ground at the south of the bay for a better look. The road continues round and over the back of this high ground to a stunning mile-long arc of white sand. This is Dreinish, with its campsite and the most beautiful macher of wildflowers and sand dunes, and is backed by the wonderful craggy high ground that protects it from the south. It is an idyllic spot, and this is where I decided to stop for the night. I then headed back to Kneep, where a little side road leads down past the most beautifully decorated cottage to a lovely little harbour. The cosy little harbour is protected to the northeast by the island of Pabby Moor and Sheeran, and a few of the other small islands are dotted about this complex entrance to Loch Rogue. The little boats moored at the harbour bobbed about in the choppy waters. The tide was in, and there was quite a bit of spray as the surf crashed against the rocky reefs in the bay. Despite the rough sea, it was actually quite a mild evening. I awoke to a lovely, calm, bright morning. Here in the summer, the cliff top is a wonderful carpet of flowers. The main way back out of this idyllic little corner of Lewis is through the short ravine from Cliff, and then past the little white Uig church on the way to the main road. The next part of my trip takes me through the deep, narrow gorge of Glen Valtos. It's the remains of a glacial meltwater channel formed about 14,000 years ago. After a mile and a half, the glen opens out to a very complex, beautiful bay, surrounded by the most wonderful scenery. I have visited this lovely area many times, but this was the first time I had been here when the tide was in. Uig Beach is best known as the site where the Lewis chessmen were found, unearthed in the early 19th century from a stone chamber beneath the sand dunes. These chessmen were thought to have been made in Norway in the 12th century from walrus ivory. These mountains are not Munros, but they are equally magnificent. I followed the road south to where I stumbled upon a sign for the Avingerag distillery. I got out for a look around. A little side road led to a group of buildings that made up the distillery, but it wasn't due to open for a couple of hours. I was disappointed. The last time legal whisky was produced in the island was almost 170 years ago. It continued on as a single-track high-level road wound its way south along the cliff tops. At the south end of the bay at Manchester, where a rocky headland juts out into the Atlantic, we find a group of rocky stacks just offshore. This was a beautiful spot, and I headed down for a closer look. The Atlantic today was as calm as the Atlantic gets. My father was stationed just beyond here, at Dreinish, with the RAF during the Second World War. I remember him pointing out this area to me about 50 years ago and telling me that he used to play football in the cliff tops here. He met my mother, a Lewis girl, a couple of years after he left here, when they were both stationed at Dollar, near Stirling. I took one last look around the rugged Uig coastline before heading back up the west coast. There are many stone circles scattered around this area, but few have the impact of the stones at Callanish. The stones date back to about 3000 BC, and the layout resembles a Celtic cross when seen from above. But it predates the Celt era by about 1500 years. 5,000 years later, this monument still stands as a credit to its builders. The reason for this circle has probably been guesswork for the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. On the island's exposed Atlantic coast is the Blackhouse village of Garenin, sitting in its remote but attractive setting. These snug little thatched cottages are made of Louisian gneiss, some of the oldest rocks in the world. Garenin was abandoned in the 70s. It gradually fell into disrepair. It was designated conservation status, and in 1989 the Garenin Trust was set up to develop and preserve this unique location. There has been a settlement in this area for over 2,000 years, but the Blackhouses here date back about 350 years. A couple of miles from Garenin, at the south end of the village of Carloway, a little side road leads to the right, to a cluster of half a dozen crofts. This is Down Carloway, the site of a remarkably well-preserved Pictish broch, standing dramatically on a stunning location in a rocky outcrop overlooking Loch and the Atlantic beyond. Built between about 50 BC and the 1st century, these brochs are some of the most impressive of our pre-Christian monuments. About 7 miles northeast of here, we come across a sign for a Norse mill and kiln. A well-made step path winds over a couple of hillocks before the 2 small thatched buildings come into view. The mill, which sits above a little loch, was still in operation until the mid-20th century. It was then known as Shawbist Mill. Many of the Lewis mills dated back to the Viking times and earlier. As I approached the buildings, I checked out the one on the right. It turned out to be the kiln. Across from it, and slightly lower, was the mill building. Water was channelled into this building from a lathe, turning the paddles which operated the millstones for grinding the grain. These dry stone buildings with their double walls and their rope-down thatched roofs were typical of the mills of the time. The outlet at the bottom side of the mill channelled the lathe water back into the feeder stream. The gap at the side of the kiln was for getting rid of the smoke. A little further on, we find the tallest standing stone in Scotland, at just under 20 foot in height. This is Clachan, the Stone of Compassion, the last remaining stone from a circle built 5,000 years ago. At Ness, about a mile below the butt of Lewis, I came across St Moluag's church. The building is thought to date from the 1100s. The fencing is to keep the sheep out. Tradition cites it as a place of healing. It was restored in the early 20th century. It has no electricity or water, and lighting is by oil lamps and candles. I decided to end my trip by visiting the part of the island where I spent so much of my childhood. Gress, with its beautiful stretches of macher-fringed sand and its meandering river, seems to be greener than the rest of the island, and stopped at the memorial to the Gress Raiders on the way up. The crofters here were promised land in the return for fighting for their country, but when they arrived back home, the offer to the crofters had been withdrawn. The farms at Gress and Call were taken by the raiders. They acquired the land and turned the farms into new crofts. My grandfather, an ace man, was one of those raiders and built the house at 34 Gress in 1923. That was where my mother grew up. I visited the croft on my way north. My cousin now owns it. I spent much of my childhood there, and it brought back many happy memories. A childhood and a heritage second to none. About 5 miles north of the croft, I arrived at the end of the road, Tolster, a typical Lewis Crofton village. Small peat stacks sit at the side of some of the houses. Its white post office sits in the middle of the village. I headed along the road leading to the northwest part of the village. At the end of the road, we find 2 of the most beautiful beaches in the island. The furthest north is Garry Sands. Garry Sands is a beautiful little bay with 5 rocky stacks protruding from the golden sand. A beautiful green stretch of Macher is surrounded by heather-clad craggy hills. At the back is a loching of water lilies, and at the far end is the River Garry, carrying peat-stained water out into the surf-tinged bay. It was a wonderful summer morning. Stornoway was bathed in the early sun. Stornoway has a very impressive seafront for a Hebridean island, and in the background the imposing castle sitting in its wooded grounds. It was a breathtaking scene. The large Calmac ferry was already loading up, and before long we were on our way. Gradually the boat drifted from the quay. The impressive town hall with its famous clock dominates the harbour side, looking just as it did when I first visited here as a boy. The old pier was much quieter now than it was then. That was the main pier in these days. Mitchell's buses were lined along the front. And as usual, I was leaving with a heavy heart.